get going. So hello, everybody, and thank you for joining another SDE session. My name is Julia Petrie from Search Discovery, and I'll be moderating behind the scenes today. So for those of you that are new to the SDEC, we're a free educational community that offers sessions like this in areas such as digital marketing and analytics. And today will be about digital strategy. If you are on this call or watching this recording and are not already a member of the SDEC, it is free to join. So I'll paste a link in the chat below where you can go and sign up. There's also a Slack group that allows you to see past recordings that you can explore there in that Slack group. So during this session, if you have any technical issues or need help regarding the SDEC, I'll be looking in the chat for those questions where you can communicate with me. And then if you have any questions for our speaker today, Stéphane, please put those in the Zoom Q&A and we'll be making sure to get all of those at the end. So I'll now hand the mic over to our presenter, Stéphane, today. So thank you so much for presenting.
Thank you. Maybe you can enable my video if I want to share. The screen is okay, but if I want to share my camera, please.
Let me. All right, there should be a button at the bottom where it says that you can start video.
Yeah, perfect. I'm doing it right now. Start video. Yeah, it says I cannot start the video because the host has stopped it. But that's fine. I can do it. Just share my screen and that's going to be fine. Let me start that right away.
All right, and if you wanted to try it one more time, I did just make you the co-host.
Okay, perfect.
There we go.
There we go. Hello, everyone.
Now we're talking.
Now I'm there. All right, so let me share my screen right away. And put that in. All right, so we're good to go. Okay, so we're going to talk about, it's an interesting title, I think. All the world is made of faith and trust in pixie dust. And it's actually a quote from James Barrie, the author of Peter Pan. So it's interesting because it talks about faith and trust. And we have to, in what we do on a daily basis, we have to have faith in the data we collect. So that's one thing. But we also have to have the trust of the users from whom we're collecting the data or doing our marketing campaigns and stuff like that. And the pixie dust is an analogy to all the pixels and tracking and cookies in whatever way we have to collect data and track users and so on. So I want to share with you some of the thinking that, things that I've been thinking about for the past several months, if not several years. We've all heard about the year of mobile. So mobile was for many years, every year we heard, oh, this is the year, it's coming up. And now I feel that we've entered another cycle. Now it's the year of privacy, or hopefully it won't be many years of privacy before people really get educated and understand what's going on and be more informed and aware of the complexity, but also the potential of what we do. So we're at the convergence of marketing and the technical aspects. So even until now, we've seen that doing an implementation of analytics or even just trackers for ad networks, sometimes it's much more difficult than what people believe. It is a challenge already. Of course, we have new tools. We have things like Google Tag Manager to help us out. It has made the job easier, but at the same time, the expectations are going to the roof. So we wanted to have the 360 view of the customer. We had the nirvana expectation that we would be able to do attribution perfectly, for example. And this was already difficult. This was already complex, and many people didn't really understand how things were interacting with each other. But now we have the third element, which is the legal aspect, and now it's getting super complex, because we have on one side we have people who understand very well the legal aspects. So they talk about compliance, they talk about the regulations, they talk about all the exceptions that are popping up everywhere under certain conditions. But really, there's like nobody in the middle, in the center of all that really understand all the consequences. So we end up with all kinds of scenarios where things are confused, it's very complex, and so on. So hopefully I'm going to be able to not give you magic recipes. I think we have plenty of resources where we can look at how to do things, but we tend to forget why we're doing this in the first place. So it's going to be maybe less of a hands-on practical stuff, but I want you to think and reflect on the state of what we're doing right now. So one thing I want to put out of the way is the distinction between privacy and data protection. And I hate to get stuck on definitions and argue about no, it means that, or it means something else. So privacy refers to the appropriate use of the data we have under the circumstance. So there's a matter of context. So it's really important to make the distinction between, because what I talk about is about privacy. While data protection, especially in Europe, data protection is the management of personal information. The confusion maybe comes from the fact that in the States, the term privacy is used in policies, in the law, and so on, while in Europe, they talk about data protection. For me, privacy necessarily implies data protection. You cannot have privacy if you don't protect the data that you want to use. So I want to kind of elevate the conversation beyond data protection and talk about privacy. The other aspect is, right now we're talking a lot about GDPR and consent and what you can or cannot do and so on. So this is really a legal approach to privacy. It's really about risk mitigation. It's really how, as an organization, as a business, what do I need to do in order to be compliant, in order to avoid any legal trouble or avoid any impact on my brand that would be detrimental to my organization. So we're looking at it from an internal perspective. I'm the business and I want to mitigate my risks. Do I really care about the users, the customers? Maybe not all the time, because the primary goal is to mitigate my risks. While what I prefer to talk about is the ethical approach to privacy. And for me, at least, and maybe I'm wrong, and you can challenge me, and you can have different perspective, and that's, for me, that's what's important about having those conversations. The ethical approach is really always putting yourselves in the shoes of your users and your customers. We pride ourselves to say, oh, we use data to make decisions. We are customer-centric. Customers are so important for us, and blah, blah, blah. And we go on, all the nice statements about how we are data-driven and customer-centric and so on. But we tend to forget about it. We tend to come back to the default, I would say, legal approach to it. So I think having an ethical approach is going beyond the legal aspect. It's always thinking, what would my users want? So as I mentioned, we there are plenty of resources. The problem with many of those resources is either they will be incomplete or they will be totally misleading. And the default is, okay, ask your lawyer if it's fine, but the lawyer understands the law, but doesn't understand all the intricacies of the technical or the technical aspects or the marketing desire of the organization to do something specific. So we get obsessed about the how, and I'm part of that also because even I have provided a lot of information about how to do things, and we tend to forget why we are doing it. So why do we do analytics in the first place? We want to understand our users. It's a legitimate intent. It's perfectly justifiable to want to understand our users. But do we want to understand our users so much that we will go against their will or against what they really desire? That's a risk. And that's what I want to talk about next. So for me, it's really about not really the fact that we're talking about cookies and consent and stuff like that. I think it's such a wrong use of our time and effort to have to deal with consent management and cookies and whether such and such application or analytics solution, for example, is compliant or not. And oh, they're not using cookies, they're using local storage or fingerprinting and so on and so on. It just makes everything more complex. While if you take an ethical approach to privacy, you will ask yourself, what do my users want? Do they want to be tracked or not? The user doesn't say, oh, I don't want to be tracked, but if it's such and such solution, that's fine, you can track me all you want because supposedly it's anonymous or it's not using cookies or whatnot. That's not the way users interact with your website. They see a consent dialogue, which is generally a super bad user experience. And they decide in a fraction of a second if they want to be tracked or not. Or, like many other people, they use ad blockers or they use a browser like Brave that in most cases you won't even see the pop-up because it's simply not being loaded at all. It's being blocked by the browser itself. So we shift from consent and cookies and all that stuff to a state of mind, to really being privacy conscious from the get-go. All the concepts of privacy by default and always asking consent and so on. So what we see now is a big shift in the tectonic plates that are, the Google, Facebook, Amazon, Apple, and so on. We see that the industry is building walled garden around their business. They want to keep the data to themselves. Apple might show like a good faith in privacy and being privacy conscious and so on, but we shouldn't be fooled by that. They are doing it because there's a commercial interest behind it. And then Facebook complains and Google does something else and so on and so on. So all of that is changing, and it's changing fairly quickly. What's interesting, I think, is that we see that some of the vendors in the industry, their reaction has been, maybe for them it's a matter of survival, but some of the reaction has been, okay, what can we do to work just at the limit, the very thin line where we're still GDPR compliant, but we push the envelope as far as we can. We go to the very limit, and we want to continue to track as much as we did before. Worst, in some cases, there are solutions that are actually being, let's say, creative and finding new ways and workarounds and ways to not use third-party cookies, for example, or be GDPR compliant, but get some exceptions, or work in a way that will be legally compliant. So they have a legal approach to it, but is it the ethical thing to do? That's a different story. we hear a lot about because third-party data will be harder to get, we need to have our own first-party data strategy, which is fine. It's part of marketing. It's part of establishing a trusted relationship with the users, and that's perfectly fine. But there are ways to do it that will respect the user privacy and the user choice. So I don't want to spend too much time on that, on data brokers that just try to find new ways of collecting as much data as before. We have plenty of different changes going on, and it's still evolving very quickly. In some cases, it's even, like Google did, it's announcing the death of the third-party cookie. I have a little news for you. I've been using Brave for a long time. It blocks third-party cookies. And you know what? The internet, the web still works for me, even if it's blocking third-party cookies. I don't have any issues. So when I hear like the cookie apocalypse and the death of the third-party cookie, it's like, so what? The web will still work. There needs to be different ways of doing things that maybe went a little way too far in some respect, but it's coming back to something that the internet and the web will continue to work. So for me, it's a matter of innovation and being respectful of the users. And I think Tim Cook, in this battle between Facebook and Apple, I think Tim Cook said it very clearly in one statement. We believe users should have the choice over the data that is being collected about them and how it's used. Super simple, super clear. Who can argue against that? Like, you cannot argue that it's not the right thing to do. Okay, Apple has other things that they are doing that maybe are less clear or less ethical, but still, at least they are taking a position. And what's interesting is that Google is following suit with also implementing privacy labels in their app store. So I think when you see something like that, of course, you can't read exactly what's there on the screen, but when you see something like that, now you know. Now you, as a user, you make the choice whether you trust enough to use this, let's say, Facebook Messenger, or whether you don't trust it enough, and you can either control the permissions or you can use a different solution. Now, imagine if instead of having those privacy policies that are super hard to read and so on, if the websites had something like that, where it clearly shows what is being collected for which purpose and so on. It could go even from a UX perspective, it could be even more interesting than that. But I think there's something there that is worth looking into. And those famous pop-ups, like each of those is incorrect for different reasons. What I don't like about it, it's most of the time it's talking about cookies. Oh, we want to drop cookies on your computer. I don't care if it's cookies. I don't care if it's local storage. I don't care. It's not the fact that it's cookies. It's what you're going to collect and what you're going to do with it. And then there are the choices: agree all, reject all, okay, and the close the dialogue, which is in the wrong position from a UX perspective. That's pretty bad. Sometimes I see the consent pop-up is behind something else on the screen, and it's hard to click on the right spot. We use cookies to ensure you have the best experience on our website. If you continue to use the site, we will assume that you are happy with it. Now, happy with the site or happy with the fact that they use cookies to provide me some miraculous experience that I typically don't see if I don't accept the cookies? Or worse, there's a nice banner and we care about you, we love you, privacy is super important to us, and so on, blah, blah, blah. You know, the violin is going on. And whether you say yes or no, they track you anyway. And I've seen that on sites that should be positioned to as an example of the best practice. And that really hurts. That makes me really sad to see that they have the banner, but they don't follow what they state on the banner. That's such a bad branding aspect. And it's from a legal perspective, it's just asking for trouble. And then you have banners where there are simply too many choices. Like, what do I want? Just the necessary cookies, or just some of them, maybe not all, maybe, I don't know. And then you have those cases where there's no consent at all. There's no pop-up at all, because even if the user says, no, I don't want to be tracked, because you as the brand owner, you have decided that you have a legitimate interest and you use one of the tools that is GDPR compliant, you even if you ask the user, do you want to be tracked? And they say no, you decide that you can still track them because legally you can, and you have a legitimate interest to do so. So be it because you configure Google Analytics in such a way that it doesn't use cookies, or it doesn't use geolocation, no remarketing option. So yeah, why ask for consent? You're going to be legally compliant, and you don't have to ask for it. There are other solutions where you don't have to ask for consent because they don't use cookies, or they don't identify the user specifically, and so on. But you just ask the user, do you want to be tracked? They said no, and you still track them. The user doesn't say, I don't want to be tracked, but it's okay if you don't use cookies. I don't want to be tracked, but it's okay if it's Google Analytics configured in such and such way. That's not what they think. So back to user centricity, back to ethics. When you ask something and the user says no, then respect the user's choice. Spotify is another example where there are just too many options. I know legally that's what they can do. The problem here is that all of them are on or active by default. Then that part is not legally compliant. So I don't know why it's still like that. So if you want to, just a shout to Brian Clifton. Brian Clifton wrote a paper called How to Achieve 70% Opt-in Rate for Website Consent. It's a way to be legally compliant. It doesn't mean that I agree 100% with it. That's fine. But at least there are ways to achieve a higher opt-in rate than the default that you would get, which would be typically like maybe 30%, depending on the site. So why I don't agree with all of that, with the fact that not using consent at all because you don't need to, because it's all anonymous, it's harmless, and so on, is because there are many studies that shows that, like, for example, 15 attributes are sufficient to identify almost 100% of the US population. 15 attributes, when you know that data brokers have hundreds and hundreds of attributes about everyone in the US and beyond. Things like 4 geolocation data points over a year are sufficient to identify one person out of a million. So just recently, last week, I wrote something about a new app that came out. It asked for tracking geolocation all the time, even if the app doesn't necessarily have to know your location in order to do what it has to do, which is providing news and information, entertaining information, and so on. It doesn't have to use geolocation. So that's worrisome. The top 150 websites over 2 weeks are sufficient to re-identify 80% of the users. So even like, you don't even need cookies. Google don't need cookies. Facebook doesn't need cookies. Just the browsing history, the pixie dust that you leave behind when you visit websites, it's sufficient to re-identify you 80% of the time with just 150 websites that you visit. And we know that we visit way more than that over a 2 weeks period. So all of those reasons makes it that between the consumer and the marketer, the legal and technical, that, you know, we had trouble between marketing and technical, and now we have trouble between marketing, technical, and legal. So we have to all understand each other, find what are the limits, what we can manage and control within that. Because we, in a way, we have to admit that it hurts that it's mostly the ad networks that have behaved in a way that eroded the trust. Digital analytics on a website, on something we control, we want to understand our users. To me, it's a legitimate interest, but it's a legitimate interest that stops where the user accepts to provide the information. So we need to rebuild that trust, and there are ways to do that. So I tried, I failed. I tried to pick the legal frameworks from GDPR, CCPA, and to confuse everything, the bunch of acronyms, but GDPR, CCPA, and in Canada, it's called CPPA. So just same letters, different order, but it's similar but different. Try to align all of those, and you won't be able. It's too complex. There are too many exceptions, and the terminology is not the same. So generally speaking, I asked some lawyers at big organizations, global organizations, what would be their approach? And the only logical solution is to go with the most restrictive one. And even then, the most restrictive one might be so difficult to really abide on each aspect that it comes back to something that I call no consent, no tracking. To me, that's what I've been pushing for. No consent, no tracking means that if you have a consent banner and you ask if they want to be tracked and they say no, no is no. It doesn't mean no, but okay if they don't use cookies. No, but if it's such and such tool, it's okay. No, but if you have a legitimate interest to do it and you can justify it, it's okay. No, but no is no. It's as simple as that. Yes, you will lose data, but you have a choice. You have a choice to be truly customer-centric and respect the user's choice that they understand, or do as we've done in the past, which is trying to gather as much data as we can. So I mentioned privacy labels. I think there is something super interesting. It doesn't have to be limited to apps. I would like to see that coming to websites. So that's one thing. I think in just a matter of a few weeks or few months, Apple and privacy labels has done more for privacy awareness to consumers than years of GDPR. It's much more effective. It's simpler to understand. There was a lot of press around it, of course. So I think there's something interesting in there that will need to continue to evolve. So no consent, no tracking, for me, is true customer centricity. You ask for permission, you get it or you don't. Now, we're talking about things that are not absolutely essential. Of course, if there's an e-commerce transaction, yes, you need the contact information, payment, and all that stuff. But what you do with it afterward, how long you store it, will you use it for something else? You need permission for that. It's the safest legal approach. You cannot be more safe than asking for permission and abiding by what they tell you. It's privacy by design and by default. And it assumed that anonymity doesn't exist, because anonymity exists only until someone finds a way to de-anonymize the information. And there was another study that came up last week, I think, that was reinforcing that point. Finding ways that in data that is supposed to be anonymized, they found new ways to analyze the data or reassign the user IDs to what was supposed to be anonymized. The other aspect are privacy labels, like I mentioned. It becomes like a de facto standard. Those icons or the way what they represent and so on, it would make things a lot easier to audit and automate, because there would be a specific format that you would follow. Audits, I see too many times like people will do an audit once a year at best, and then they forget about it. While things are changing so fast that they need to constantly monitor what's going on and review what's going on. And I think we're not doing a good job at that. There are tools that are starting to emerge, but they tend to be really focused on specific solutions, or they lack the depth of details when they look at across several different vendors. The other area that is interesting that I've been looking into is natural language processing and machine learning of privacy policies. Basically looking at the terminology that is used in the privacy policy to extract what is really the most important, or transform it into another format like privacy labels, for example, in order to simplify the whole thing. And then advanced data protection control is something that I think is interesting. So essentially the idea is that the browser, just like the browser is able to understand, things like the title in a web page and so on, or Google will look at the metadata in the rich snippet within a page. What if the privacy definitions were using rich snippets in some way, so that the browser would be able to see that? We wouldn't need consent pop-ups anymore. It would be controlled by the browser itself, much more user-friendly in terms of UX. You could granularly look at, accept all the time they ask for geolocation, regardless of the website, for example, or you could go granular and accept on a specific website. So I think that that's the way to go in the future. Just recently, the UK is asking the G7 for overhaul of the concept of asking for consent. So I think things will continue to evolve. It will be a challenging road ahead, that's for sure. I didn't want to give you magic recipes to do it, because there's no magic. It will always go back to, oh, there are exceptions, you need to check with your lawyer, and so on and so on. So it's one of the dream I had was to create scenarios where you would, under those conditions, here's how you should do it. And I couldn't do it. It's just too complex. There are too many exceptions. So the thing is that when you look at think about some of the brands, Patagonia, for example, is a brand that is well known for its eco-friendliness and diversity and equity and inclusion and so on. Privacy is viewed right now as a real pain. Data compliance is a real pain. Legal risk mitigation is a real pain, and so on. But we need to shift that around and think more creatively. It is our role as analysts and as marketers to find solutions so that we balance the respect of our users, and that we also build equity in the long term, but because we are a brand, an organization that really cares about data privacy and data protection and the legal aspects of it. So now it's time to turn to the Q&A. I want to hear from you. I want to hear what you have to say. Do you agree or disagree, and so on. That's super important for me to open the conversation. So I'm all listening. I see there are already some questions in the Q&A. Okay, let's go with, I won't read them ahead of time. I will just jump in. Feel free to interact again. So no consent, no tracking sounds great in theory, but in my opinion, it is a problem of spheres of the same length and enforceability. Yeah. There will be few companies to follow such a mantra if they know this won't be enforced by legal authorities in a fair, same enforcement for all manner, and if they know this gives their competitors competitive. Oh yeah, that's a good point. One of the argument is that why would I embrace a no consent, no tracking philosophy if my competitors are not doing it? So Of course, it's true, but it depends if you still see it gradually as something that is counterintuitive to your brand value, or if eventually you see it as something that can bring value to your brand. In the future, two similar companies where one is careless about privacy and doesn't really care about it and is not transparent, doesn't give user control. And then you have a competitor that does all the opposite and respect their users and so on. Which one is going to win in the long term? I think we're reaching a point where in the long term, privacy is going to be an asset for those brands. But it's beyond that. It's also the fact that if you think in terms of no consent, no tracking, by default, you put yourselves in the mindset of your users, instead of thinking primarily of how can I reduce my risk from a legal perspective. So it's you shift the angle. So there's no magic again. It's just I think it's worth thinking about it. The other question is, how can an analyst explain no consent, no tracking without losing our stakeholder interest? Money talks. What is the cost of a privacy scandal or data leak to the brand? If you want to really reduce the risks, no consent, no tracking is the safest approach to it, because users who don't want to be tracked will not be tracked. Of course, you still need to enforce data protection when it comes to personal data related to your sales and stuff like that. But ad networks, digital analytics, do we really, like, it's not essential. It's really, really useful, but it's not essential for the task at hand at the time where a customer wants to purchase something. Plus, there's something else also. Don't forget that digital analytics and ad networks all are not the only sources of data that you have. You have sales data, you have customer data in your back office systems. Doing analysis on that, given that it was stated, you can do it, the data is there. So I read something just this morning where it talked about maybe one of the point was that maybe the fact that we need to ask for consent and we will get less data, maybe it will force us to go back to a true research approach where Avinash Kaushik talked about multiplicity a long time ago, where we use multiple data sources to do our analysis instead of blindly relying on the data provided by web analytics or words provided by third-party vendors like Facebook and so on, that has a vested interest to give you just enough information, but keep it foggy so that they retain the true value of the data they have. So I think the way to bring it to the stakeholders is to balance the risk mitigation, which is kind of odd that I say that, but I think that would be a good approach to do it. So let me see if there are, I see in the chat, there are a couple of questions also. So let me switch there. Ambivalent, yeah, that's from Iona. That's an ambivalent subject. I'm not surprised. I hear a lot of arguments where on our end of, we see it as the users are coming to my site. It's like they're entering my store. So I have a legitimate interest to see what they are doing. And in this way, I'm going to be able to better serve them. We hear that all the time. But imagine if that same customer enters the store and you're at the door and you ask them, are you okay if I track you in all the steps that you're going to make in the store and what you look at and so on? And if they tell you, no, I'm not comfortable with that, and you still do it, is it good customer service? I don't think so. So we can go with all kinds of analogies and so on. I thought about so many of them and argue with other people, pros and cons and so on. You make your own choices as a brand and as an analyst and as a marketer. The point about the UI and the UX, yeah, that's such a bad user experience. It's incredible, and probably worse because the UX is always different depending on the site where you go. It just makes things worse. There was a comment that Shopify website is already compliant. Everything is turned off by default. That's great. If that's the case, I will change my presentation for the next time. At the time I looked at it, it was on by default. Maybe it was just in my account, I don't know. And Adam was saying, as long as we are behaving in a manner consistent with consumer advocacy, UX improvement, customer service, then we are free to collect non-PI data. Yes, that's one of the strong arguments for not asking for any consent, because you have a legitimate interest to track users anonymously without any personal data, because you want to understand what they are doing and so on. I think my crutch is where I have an issue is when there's a consent dialogue that asks specifically, do you allow us to use cookies or track you in some ways? And they say no, but let's take Google Analytics as an example. If they say, yes, I agree to all the tracking and everything, then you can use geolocation. You don't need IP obfuscation. You can use remarketing if you want to. You can assign a user ID and so on. But if they say no, you decide to still use Google Analytics, but you disable IP. You enable IP obfuscation. You disable remarketing, but you still track them. So the gray area is between asking if you can do all of that, and if they say yes, okay, that's fine. But if they say no, you still decide to track them anyway because you have a technical solution to work around the compliance requirements and the fact that you're not collecting any personal data. That's where I think there's a gray area, because the user just said, no, I don't want to be tracked. I don't agree, but you still do it. So to me, that's one of the thing that I don't like about this approach. The definition of PI varies by both platforms and laws. It depends on a lot of context. Oh yes, absolutely. And that's why, again, that's why the no consent, no tracking is the safest approach. Because if they said no, you don't track anyway, so you don't have any personal data. But in some jurisdictions, classic ones are IP address or geolocation, if it's really accurate or not. Some would argue that a device ID is not personal data because it's the device, it's not the person, and we're just playing on the terms here. All those things. So that's it for me. There might be other Q&A. Oh yes, there's a couple more. Let me try to answer some of them, and stop me if I go beyond the time. Otherwise, I will just take those questions offline and answer in a post. All right. So let's try first one. Google has rolled out a consent mode. Well, yes, it's fine that they do that. More of the vendors and solution should do that. Have some easier way to abide by the consent approach. As long as some vendors do not respect that, you will obviously still have to use like a consent dialogue and all those aspects. So yeah, I think it's a step in the right direction, but there's still work to be done in order to really embrace a consent mode across all the solutions, which I think is probably elusive we probably won't see that. Another one, would you say that masking data collection under first-party data and then share it with the same vendors is a legitimate process? So is it, if I understand well, it's, let's talk just a little bit about server-side tracking. I've seen too many times people thinking that, oh, because we're going to move server-side, so this way we won't have to ask for consent. So it shows like it's collecting on a first-party environment, but it's really sending the data to a third party. Server-side doesn't alleviate your requirement to ask for consent, not at all. It doesn't solve anything. Yes, from a technical standpoint, it's interesting because, yeah, there can be some speed improvements and stuff like that. But from a legal standpoint, it doesn't change anything, in my opinion. I'm not a lawyer. So. But yeah, I think pretending to care about privacy, but playing a game behind the scene, nah, that's not the way to go, not in the long term. We still have to log file analysis. Mitchell is asking about log file analysis compared to tag-based analysis. It's interesting. That's another area where we might think that using server-side or using log files would be a magic solution to avoid asking for consent and everything. It's still the same. The log file has a purpose which typically is technically or technical oriented. So it's about the to make sure that the website is running smoothly and all that stuff. It has a purpose as a system to have a log file. But if you use the log file for analysis and worse for analysis of personal data, so you really have some personal data in there and you assign the user and so on, then you still need to have consent to do that. So it's not, we have to think that it's not the location of the data, it's what you do with it. It's how it was collected, why it's going to be used, and all the other aspects of how long it's going to be used, what's the user control, and so on. But the primary thing, if you think of, it's not where the data is, it's what you do with it. You won't get stuck with cookies or no cookies and log files and server side. You will remove all of that. Just think in terms of how is the data being used, and that's going to be much more simple to understand. That being said, back in the days, we used log files and the world, we thought it was complex. I remember that. And we thought it was, oh, analytics is so hard. And we thought it was complex and so on. And now we know better. Now it's much more complex. And the last one. Oh, another one just popped in, but I think we went beyond, yeah? Right?
Yes, it does look like that is all the time we have, but we can definitely take these questions offline and send them out as well.
Perfect. Thank you so much, everyone, for listening. And I will follow up with the latest Q&A, maybe add a little more information. So again, thank you for having me.
Of course, thank you so much for your time today. And we'll see everybody back at the next SDEC session.
Thank you.
Thank you. Bye.